It's called consolidating the empire because England is coming out of the 7 Years' War, right? The French and Indian War, where they've just acquired all of this territory. Basically, all of the French colonial claims to North America, England now has, and Spain also. Spain took parts, and then England took basically all of Canada. Canada is going to remain a part of, is going to be tied to England until the end of World War II. In 1867, Canada gets independence relatively, but they still are attached. Their foreign policy is still attached to England. So in World War I and World War II, when England declares war on Germany, Canada is automatically at war, right? So Canada stays in the British Empire or whatever for a very long time. But it's called consolidating the empire because they've acquired all this new territory on top of the colonies they already have. Like they're not consolidating in the sense that, like when you consolidate several boxes into one, they're not stacking the colonies on top of each other or moving everybody. But it's basically just, okay, we're going to have a uniform policy. We're going to try to rein in our control over all these colonies in a way that they really hadn't done before. Previous to this era, basically there were navigation acts, there was trade regulation, right? They made money off the colonies through trade. That mercantilism thing. And even that was not very regulated. There was lots of smuggling, lots of people who ignored the laws. So that's one thing that's going to change. They're going to start enforcing these, they're called navigation acts. They're going to start enforcing them much more rigorously, start penalizing people. And that's going to upset a lot of, I mean, if you're involved in trade, if you own a ship that goes back and forth trading goods between Europe and the colonies, and you've gone the entire time doing it 10, 20 years without ever having to worry about customs person checking your boat or charging you taxes, and people just got away with it. And all of a sudden, now you're getting hit every single time. Imagine if there were no parking meters in downtown, and people could just there were parking meters, but nobody enforced it, right? And for 10, 20 years, we just drive around, we park wherever we want, we stay as long as we want, several days, nothing happens, and then all of a sudden, every time you park, 20 minutes, even if it's for 10, 20 minutes, you're getting a ticket. So they're going to start basically imposing their authority over the colonies in a way that for the 13 colonies that declare independence, they're not used to that. They were used to having colonial assembly, colonial government, basically where they were self-governing in most ways, and there was just some trade regulation. So the enforcement of the Navigation Acts, which is what that Townshend Acts thing right there, that one right there, that Townshend Acts, that 1767, it's named after a government official. It relates to the enforcement of the Navigation Acts and a few other things. Basically, they were designed to raise revenue because England's in debt after this war, right? The 7 Years' War puts them in debt, and they figure, well, we're in debt because of fighting a war mostly in the colonies here, defending these people, and they don't really pay taxes like people in England do. So let's start taxing them more because they should be bearing the burden of this debt also, right? And that's going to be a problem because there's no actual colonial representatives in government in England, right? They're just being taxed. They're being taxed by a government that they recognize, like we're a part of England, we're British subjects, but they don't get to vote for parliament members, right? Whereas now, theoretically, people in America vote for congressmen, vote for presidents, congressperson. And then so any taxes that result from laws they pass, we've theoretically agreed to by vote, choosing them. So the Townshend Acts, so enforcement of the Navigation Acts. The proclamation line we already talked about, that proclamation basically saying that you can't migrate beyond the Appalachians. There can be no westward movement. All this new territory is off limits. And then the big one that's cited, this is really if you wanted to pinpoint a year where the revolutionary or colonial crisis, calling it a crisis or something that really escalates, you would probably look at the Stamp Act, which sounds like the most boring thing. I know, it sounds horribly boring, doesn't it? The stamp, it's like the Golf Act. Basically, there's paper that has an imprint on it from the British government, and you have to pay for this paper they sell it, you have to buy it from them. And I think maybe if people got their own paper made through other means, they'd have to buy these actual stamps to stick on the paper that they, either you buy it from the British government and it already has this thing on it, or you'd have to attach a stamp to any other paper later on. For all sorts of documents, like legal documents, if people wanted to sell a business, if people wanted to get married, if people wanted to sell slaves, probably sell indenture contracts, which still existed, right? Sell all of these things, or if they wanted any sort of thing like that, right? If they wanted any sort of government document or legal or financial thing, they'd have to get this paper with a stamp, and and the price of the paper varied based on what they were doing. And this may not seem like that big of a deal. This is the first attempt at what's called direct taxation on the colonists, direct taxes, right? Like the income tax, a direct tax. Before this, the Navigation Act, when you tax trade, it's not the same thing. When you tax trade, if you're a merchant engaged in trade, you're having to pay customs duties, you're having to be regulated, and some of that indirectly you transfer to the buyer, right? Like you charge more or whatever, but they're not really seeing that, they're not seeing the full effect of it. This is the first example of when the colonists are actually seeing, okay, now we're all being taxed for this thing. We weren't having to pay taxes for this before. So it basically upsets most of the colonists, right? All colonists are affected by this. And also, each colony has a government which raises taxes for stuff inside the colonies, right? So there are these colonial assemblies that basically raise taxes for colonial purposes, right? Even the governors, there's a royal governor appointed by London to each colony. But even those folks have an income that is dependent on what the colonial assemblies would agree to. Like they agree, we'll compensate the governor this much. A lot of it was, to be honest, a lot of it was graft, right? Or because they would get some sort of nominal fee from the British government, but then they would compensate their income doing other things. Like Benjamin Franklin, for example, when this Stamp Act passes, and the important thing is this Stamp Act, this is where these taxes are where the concept of no taxation without representation comes from, right? And the colonists say we have no representation in Parliament. Parliament's passed these taxes, but we don't have anybody in there representing us that we voted for. So how can this be fair? The British government argues that they have virtual representation. That, well, you don't actually vote for anybody, but you're our subjects, so you're a part. You're somehow represented indirectly. It was kind of a BS answer, basically. But this tax, the Stamp Act, there was such a public outrage over it. It's actually repealed in 1766. Benjamin Franklin actually goes to Parliament and argues against the Stamp Act, why it should be repealed. He actually supported it originally, and then he was against it. And then when it passed, he made sure that he could get his buddies jobs as tax collectors. But the Stamp Act is repealed, right? So that's something that a lot of people don't realize. Because when people think of the revolution, a lot of times we think of overthrowing a monarchy, right? Well, we didn't want a king. We wanted a democracy. All of these laws that are upsetting the colonists are being passed by Parliament. They're not necessarily, very little of this is actually the result of something that the king at the time is George III. He doesn't do very much to create this situation. It's mostly Parliament. And actually the colonists they write these appeals to the king, like we're your loyal subjects, why are you letting Parliament do this to us? They were very proud to be a part of the British Empire. And so the idea that this sort of stuff would lead to Declaration of Independence, for a lot of people, in the 1760s, they did not see that being the situation. They saw that we could reconcile this, we can deal with this is still the best country in Europe for us to be associated with, and they were all mostly of English ancestry, right? Here's a good quotation, actually. This is from a book that through their use of the English language, their faith in Protestant religious orders, and their adherence to British notions of liberty and justice, they celebrated their place as assimilated subjects of the British Atlantic community. This is another one. This is actually from page 152 of the book, Give Me Liberty. 152. British governments during the first half of the 18th century adopted a policy of salutary neglect, which I think in high school we learned it as benign neglect. I'm not sure how they teach it. Was it benign? Salutary neglect towards the colonies, leaving them largely to govern themselves. That's the main thing, leaving them largely to govern themselves. When that ends, right, you have restraints, right? Remember that thing about the anatomy of revolution? There are restraints put in place. These are all restraints, right? You can't move onto this land. You have to pay these taxes. And then when people are angry over those restraints, you see a response that doesn't handle it well, right? I mean, so the British government repeals the Stamp Act, But then they issue this thing called the Declaratory. There's a lot of acts, you know, we're not doing all of them. The Declaratory Act. They basically say, okay, we're repealing the Stamp Act, but we declare that we have the right to tax colonists. Like you're our colonial subjects. These are our colonies, and you know, they had a point to a certain extent, right? I mean, as far as protection from the British military and you know, all sorts of stuff like naval protection, right? And the colonists were not paying nearly as many taxes as people in England were. So on the, you know, both sides kind of have points. But they declare in this Declaratory Act, after repealing the Stamp Act, we have the right to tax colonists however we want, right? These are our colonies. And so they've ended up passing these things called the Townshend Acts, which are various ways of raising revenue. And also, I think one of them involves the whole concept of, who knows the Quartering Act? Who learned about the Quartering Act? Third Amendment is that troops, sounds really antiquated because it kind of is, but it's important. The troops shall not be quartered in the homes of Americans, right? You don't have to house soldiers. It's basically this fear of an army. Who's ever heard of posse comitatus? This idea that you cannot use the military. It's called the quartering domestically, the Quartering Act. A lot of people misinterpret this act as saying that the British military could kick in the door to your house and say, this soldier needs a place to sleep. He gets to your kid's bedroom. The royal governor, the governor appointed by England, had the right to take any buildings that were not being used, like private buildings that the government didn't own, but they were owned by colonists. But if they were vacant at the time, basically to use them to house troops. So it's not like they're coming into your house at dinner time like, his name is Steve, he's a private. You give him a plate and he gets to sleep in your kid's top bunk. Now you have these taxes that are upsetting people. The regulation of trade, right, which Boston is going to be the center of a lot of this revolutionary activity. So you have all of these taxes that are upsetting people, especially around Boston is a city of trade, right? It's a city with a harbor where there's lots of commerce going through it. Philadelphia, Boston, New York, and then Charleston in South Carolina is really the one southern city that's a big city that ends up being a pretty good sized city and also engaged in trade. So you have all these taxes, all these people engaged in trade. They all live in Boston. They're all getting pissed off. And then you also now have the presence of lots of troops. And also you have a navy, because one of the elements of these various Townshend Acts is that the British Navy actually starts impressing sailors. You hear about this in the War of 1812. It's not like they impressed them like they pulled their boat up. What's up? You want to go for a ride on my boat? Yeah. Not like that kind of impressing them. Like they would kidnap them basically. They would go take a private vessel. And like people like John Hancock, the guy who signed the Constitution, he's one of the wealthiest people in Massachusetts. But so one of his boats, you know, the British Navy just comes up to it as it's coming into the harbor and takes sailors because they needed people to man their ships. I don't know how you end up with the most powerful navy in the world when all you're doing is just coming up to the side of other ships and going, come on, get on the boat, you're working for us now. Imagine you're John Hancock and you're now all of a sudden you're getting slapped with massive customs fees. Right before you were bringing whatever you wanted into the colonies, and there really wasn't regulation, and now every ship you have is getting stopped, so he and other people take cargo. John Hancock did this with wine once. He had a bunch of wine, and he took all these crates of wine and put it onto smaller ships, and had the ships sort of go land in some beach area somewhere, and then showed up. But when the problem is when they show up at the Boston Harbor and the British customs people are there, the ship gets like way higher than it should be because it's lighter. Right, because they just dumped like 75-80% of their cargo, so they would only have to pay like a small amount. And these British customs people are looking at them like, wait, why you went all the way to Europe and back, and you got like, why is most of your ship empty? Like, why would you even do that? That doesn't seem like profitable. He's like, no, I don't know, you know. And so eventually they catch on to stuff like that, and it creates a lot of tension. And you have a lot of troops in Boston, right? You have a lot of military now present. And also, a lot of those soldiers would compensate their income by working at Boston Harbor. So now these people who normally would go out to Boston Harbor for work have more competition for jobs, right? Because these soldiers weren't here before, and now there are all these soldiers here, and you're regulating everything we do. And these soldiers, because they're here now and they want to make more money, they're showing up at Boston Harbor and getting work. And you know, you've seen the old movies, right, where they do that stuff in like the Depression. where there's a group of guys like on the waterfront, where there's a group of guys lined up, and the guy foreman comes out, he's like, you and you, that's all for today, everybody. Like that sort of thing, you know. And you get there 5 minutes after, a bunch of red coat jerks. You're like, this guy took our jobs. This is mainly an economic situation, right? Usually it's the taxes, and it stuff like this always comes down to like money, right? Cash rules everything around me. Cream, get the money. Dollar bill, y'all. Economic reasons, right? Economic reasons. And so you end up with a situation where there is what's called the Boston Massacre. There are protests. There's these protests, usually organized by a group called the Sons of Liberty. And these colonists start protesting outside of this building where these British soldiers are. And maybe they start throwing snowballs and stuff. And maybe some of the snowballs had like rocks in them and hit the soldier. And so these troops basically opened fire onto this group of colonists who from their perspective, maybe it was basically a riot, you know. At this point, they also had a few customs officials who had been tarred and feathered. You know what tarred and feathered means? Tarred and feathered. It's when they would pour hot tar on your skin, and then cover it in feathers. It's kind of weird. It's really hot. I mean, it's like, you know, when they're laying asphalt in the street and they pour that stuff out. Imagine if they just poured it all over you. It was not pleasant. John Adams actually defends these soldiers in this Boston Massacre because they actually stand trial, right? And he defends them because for one of the reasons that John Adams defends these soldiers is he's very much like a guy who's like the rule of law. Like there's law, and these you know, they deserve a fair trial. But John Adams, a lot of the colonists, the leadership of the revolution too, are very elite. They're snobs basically, right? A lot of them are very wealthy slave owners. John Adams does not own slaves, but he's this Boston lawyer. They see themselves as being the sort of they are in many ways this upper echelon of colonial society. But they definitely have a better education. They come from better, you know, more affluent upbringing. They are very fearful of the rule of the concept of mob rule, right? The concept of people, the masses of people working, like what we would call like working class people, or blue collar people, or rank and file people. They didn't have those terms back then, but basically taking over the streets, or this idea of this is one of the reasons that people don't support revolution. It takes a long time for people to support independence, because they see separating from England. What happens when we separate from England and all of these people start rising up and they start demanding their own property? They start demanding that they start demanding stuff from us, right? What happens when slaves start rising up and demanding their freedom, right? They see there's a lot of fear because there's the revolutionary leadership, like the people on all our money and stuff that we talk about, like chopping down the cherry tree, George Washington. All of these people, they own, like a lot of them own slaves. They're very wealthy, and so they very much want to control, like in a lot of ways want to control the sort of tone of this revolution, right? They're very fearful of what might happen if it gets out of hand, basically in their eyes. So, and that's one of the reasons a lot of people don't support independence, is because they're too worried about that, right? There's a big question mark looming. We know that the British, okay, they tax us a little bit, we don't like it, but what happens when we separate from England? This is an actual person who does get tarred and feathered twice, and it happens twice because this doesn't really show it in the scene, he's a real asshole. He was really violent and aggressive towards people, and so they eventually dragged him out of his house and they tarred and feathered him. So that's actually who this is. His name's John Malcolm, this guy right here. So these are colonists, right? And then you see, they show, this is in 1774. So it's after the Boston Massacre. It's after the Boston Tea Party too, which helps because you see they sort of reference the Boston Tea Party there. It's a political cartoon. The Boston Tea Party, you guys familiar with the Boston Tea Party? It didn't go down like this. Because you can't, there was like a big old crate of loose leaf tea. It was really heavy. They couldn't just, pick it up and, like that. They probably just busted it with hatchets and stuff and poured it out. But they poured out like 342 crates of tea. There was a tax on tea, but the problem wasn't that the tax made tea too expensive. It was that there were various times where boycotts were called on British goods, right? You're gonna put tax us now and regulate trade. We're just not gonna buy anything. We're gonna make our own clothes. It was called homespun. Right? We're gonna make our own clothes. We're gonna do, we're not gonna buy anything from England, so we're not gonna pay your tax. But with the Boston Tea Party, you have this company, the East India Company, is given so many tax breaks and so many subsidies by England, by the government. They're allowed to sell their tea now really cheap, right? They basically get subsidized by the government, so they're able to sell their tea for very low prices. So even with this tax, it was like 3 cents on tea. Colonists are still going to pay it because it's still the tea is way cheaper, right? It's just way less expensive. But the problem is that now they're paying, every colonist is going to pay that tax, and so people got pissed off that they felt like it was a manipulation of the economy, which it was. So they basically took over this boat and destroyed all this tea. And it's actually one example where there was a massive amount of property that was destroyed, but it wasn't violent. A lot of these throughout this period, there's a lot of periods of explosive moments of violence and stuff.